So I don't usually talk as a person, non-reading being on this, but this one seems important. I haven't gone through the entire part, but I've stopped several times already. Um, uh, if you don't know, I read books. This book that I'm reading is An Approach to Sanity. Now, randomly picked off my shelf. We will discuss that at some point in the future. It's a study of East-West relations, and it's by Field Marshal the Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, KG, published 1959. And this is after the nuclear answer to Japan in World War II. And it was it's around the foundations of NATO. And I'm going to try to do my best to read this to you because it feels like as far as I've gotten, it feels very important and relative. And I think maybe sometimes I don't know the absolute truth or personality of this writer or this piece because I haven't gone through the whole thing because as I read fresh, not knowing what I'm reading ahead of time. Let's do this. Sorry. There's a little note at the beginning, and then I will get into the actual reading. It's my talks with Mr. Khrushchev in Moscow. In February 1959, Mr. Macmillan had visited Moscow. The next month, in March, it was announced that the foreign ministers of Britain, the USA, France, and Russia would meet in Geneva on the 11th May 1959. I decided to visit Moscow before the meeting of the foreign ministers. I went as a private citizen, without any authority except my own. There were 3 things I particularly wanted to find out. What was the Russian view on war, an all-out nuclear war? Were they prepared to risk such a war to gain their ends, or were they not? 2. What did the Russians think about the Germans? Were they frightened of them or not? 3. What did the Russians think about the Chinese? This was an important point in my thinking. An interesting situation would arise if it emerged that the Russians were afraid of what might happen on their 2 flanks, a united Germany in the west and hostile China in the east. The 2 articles which now follow give the account of my talks in the Kremlin with Mr. Khrushchev. So, article begins. The conflict between East and West is a vast subject, and historians will place its origins far back in history. My own practical connection with the conflict is limited to the period since the end of the Second World War. In the years immediately after the end of that war, we were badly placed, and we lost ground everywhere. Then we got ourselves organized in Europe by means of NATO. And we lost no more ground there. Though there are, of course, grave dangers elsewhere, notably in Africa and in Asia, which includes the Middle East. The situation today in Europe is that after years of toil and frustrations, the Western Alliance has worked itself into a good position vis-a-vis the Eastern Bloc, led by Russia. On no account must we weaken our position. On the contrary, we must hold it and continue to strengthen it by the unity of purpose among the Western nations. Our aim is peace, peace with honor, and not by appeasement of the other side. But we must be willing to negotiate towards a reduction of the present tension, wherever and whenever this can be safely done, without jeopardizing Western unity and Western security and interests. What is the good of continuing to hurl threats of nuclear destruction at each other? That way leads to war, with all the misery which war brings to the masses of the people. We want to bring our children up to be good citizens in a peaceful world. We must not hand over to them the unsolved problems of today, with all the disunity suspicion and mistrust which exists. But as things are, they hear continual talk of war, and it is not good for them. A major trouble on our side is that when some sensible ideas for easing tension are put forward, such as those recently suggested by Mr. Macmillan, they are immediately submerged in a morass of allied discussions, and finally, only some compromise skeleton emerges. This lack of common purpose and interminable argument about unimportant detail, which tends to cloud the real issue, suits the Eastern book very well. See, now that's common. It's everybody's book now, okay? We know that. It is a sign of our lack of true unity. An all-out nuclear war between East and West is not wanted by either side. The new key to strategy, the nuclear deterrent, has helped in this respect. But there are a very great number of problems to be solved. If the solutions to all these problems are put into one package deal, it will not be possible to reach agreement on the package. A great deal of suspicion and mistrust on both sides has first got to be removed. Surely we must begin slowly, agree minor moves which do not affect the military security of either sides, and advance step by step, creating mutual confidence as we go. Surely we must begin slowly, agree minor moves which do not affect the military security of either side, and advance step by step, creating mutual confidence as we go. Question. Having considered the matter carefully, I finally decided I would like to visit Moscow and discuss the tangled problem of European security with the Soviet leader and his military advisors. For me, it would be a personal and private fact-finding visit to investigate the problem for myself and to see if there was any light at the end of the dark tunnel. And I was certain there must be some light, as surely as the dawn follows the night. And so, having first ascertained from Mr. Macmillan that such a visit by me would cause no embarrassment to him or the British government, I wrote to the Soviet ambassador in London, and the matter was quickly arranged. One point was firmly fixed in my mind. If it became clear that there was no light to be seen at the end of the dark tunnel, no gleam of hope, we in the West must not be afraid of what might come. We would have to brace ourselves and put no limit on our endurance, knowing that if war came, it would be a nuclear war. The nation which puts a limit to its fight to preserve its own way of life will abandon the struggle when that limit is reached, and will inevitably succumb. Never let us do that. Such were the thoughts which had formed in my mind when the Russian jet Tu-104, in which I was traveling, landed safely in Vnukovo Airport. Vnukovo Airport, some 20 miles outside Moscow. But how to put all of these things over to Mr. Khrushchev? And what answers would I get? It was dark. But powerful arc lights lit up the scene, and I at once recognized my old friend Marshal Sokolovsky, surrounded by a milling crowd of press correspondents and photographers. It was a most friendly welcome. I'm going to start this over. This is not coming across well. Okay. It was dark. But powerful arc lights lit up the scene, and I at once recognized my old friend Marshal Sokolovsky and photographer. Surrounded by a milling crowd of press correspondents and photographers. It was a most friendly welcome. After some difficulty, we managed to get to our car and depart for the British Embassy. My first engagement was to visit Mr. Khrushchev the next morning, the 29th of April, in the Kremlin. I went alone. In addition to the Soviet leader, the following were present at the meeting: Marshal Sokolovsky, an interpreter, and an official from the Soviet Foreign Office. I sat alone, Faced across the table by 4 Russians, I asked the Soviet leader if he would give me his views on the present situation in Europe. He said he would gladly do so. This is what he told me. The overall aim of the Soviet Union is peace. The simplest way to achieve this aim is to dissolve the 2 military blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and withdraw national forces back to their own countries. But this is not agreed by the Western powers. A disturbing factor is that nuclear weapons are now assuming a paramount role, and this creates a nervous attitude throughout Europe, and indeed the world. We have reached the position where each side, East and West, could devastate the other with nuclear weapons. It was commonly thought that Russia could not devastate the United States. This was very false thinking. Russia could most certainly devastate the United States with her missiles. But all such talk led only to mistrust and suspicion, and the greater the degree of control by one side over the employment of missiles and defense against bombers, the greater the mistrust on the other side. Some steps must be taken to do away with this situation. We must find a formula which would be agreed by both sides. The simplest way was to make a peace treaty with the 2 Germanys, the Federal Republic and the German Democratic Republic, with real guarantees for West Berlin. If the Western powers refuse to do this, then Russia will act alone and negotiate a peace treaty with the Democratic Republic. If this should lead to war, Russia cannot escape her destiny. Nobody wants to see the reunification of Germany at present, but few people have the courage to say so. Adenauer doesn't want it. The French don't want it, nor do the British. Russia certainly doesn't want it. He asked me for my views on the subject. I said it was my personal opinion that the reunification of Germany, though very desirable, was today not practical politics because of what he had said. He continued. If it could be agreed that national forces should remain to their own countries, then Russia would accept a very comprehensive plan of inspection and control of national territories. But a truly comprehensive inspection system is not possible so long as the armed forces of the 2 blocs are facing each other in Europe, ready to be alerted for battle at short notice. To allow inspection of each other's forces and dispositions under such conditions would be absurd. But once all the forces have been withdrawn to their own countries, the proper conditions for inspection would be created. The war situation would then be calmed down, and an inspection system would gradually remove mistrust and produce confidence. Here I interposed a question. I said he gave me the impression that Russia was afraid of Germany and of the revival of that country. Would he care to enlarge on this point? He said Russia was apprehensive about Germany, not afraid, and about a possible revengeful spirit which might arise in that country. It looked as if federal Germany might soon take a leading position in Western Europe. She might eventually persuade the Western allies to march eastwards. I said I couldn't believe that would ever happen. He then said the day might come when a united Germany would again march westwards. I said I also didn't believe that would happen, and if by chance it did, I hoped the Russians would lend a hand to stop it. I then asked if Russia was frightened of what China might do in the long run. He said no. China was a hinterland for Russia. There were 2 nations back to back, each looking after the other's rear areas. At this stage, he asked me to comment on his remarks. I said it was clear from what he had said that there was a very tangled situation to be sorted out. That was a matter for the political leaders of both sides. I was a soldier. I had taken part in 2 world wars, both of which could, in my opinion, have been prevented by the political leaders of those days. In neither case had we received the benefits which it was hoped, and even promised, peace would bring. It must not be allowed to happen all over again, with the suffering and misery war brings to the mass of the people of a nation. We must plan to hand over a more peaceful world to the youth of our nations. It would be a mistake to try and solve all the problems in one package deal. It is doubtful if there would ever be agreement by all concerned on the package. Surely we should start slowly, take one point at a time, and gradually remove suspicion and mistrust as we go along. A situation existed in Europe which could lead to an all-out nuclear war between the East and West. The so-called Cold War was not my business. But if the Cold War led to a hot war, we should all have failed, politicians and soldiers. The first thing for us all to do was to negotiate that any possibility of a hot war will be quickly removed. The immediate danger spot appeared to me to be in Berlin. There was a situation there which, if not quickly solved, could lead to a hot war. And this I gathered from what he had just said. Let us therefore settle that quickly. We could ease the present tension by agreeing two measures. First, get the United Nations organization in on the Berlin problem. The aim would be to produce a sound United Nations plan for West Berlin and definite United Nations guarantees acceptable to both sides. Second, to agree a simple inspection plan, possibly in a defined area initially, which could be extended gradually as mutual confidence was gained. These two measures would begin to remove suspicion and mistrust. Once that desirable state of affairs had been reached, all the other points he mentioned in his analysis could be discussed between the political leaders in a far better atmosphere than was possible today. Mr. Khrushchev said he agreed with these two measures and would be prepared to discuss how they could be best implemented. We then dispersed. Mr. Khrushchev agreed we should meet again the next morning, 30th April. I spent the afternoon touring the streets of Moscow in order to see the people. And I visited a large department store for children and bought some toys for my grandchildren. The Russians wanted to take me to the theater that night, but I declined, saying that I wanted to be quiet and think about the problem which confronted us. We met again in the Kremlin at 11 a.m., and again I faced the same four Russians across the table. This time I opened the discussion myself, with Mr. Khrushchev's agreement. I said I had spent the previous afternoon in the streets of Moscow, seeing the Russian people shopping before the May festival. I had visited the great university on the hill outside the city, with its 22,000 students. I had visited a children's department store. It is these people who suffer if war comes, the ordinary people, the common man, the man in the street, the children. Let both blocks, East and West, cooperate to extinguish all the sparks which could possibly light a fire which might result in World War III. But so great was the suspicion and the mistrust on both sides. It would be useless for the two blocs to discuss major problems until some of the suspicion and mistrust could be removed, and a calmer atmosphere prevailed. I was alarmed by one statement he had made yesterday, that if the West would not agree to peace treaties with the two Germanys, and then Russia would negotiate a peace treaty with the East Germany, even if this should lead to in the end to war. I hoped he did not mean that. No good could follow from trying to go it alone. Let us take one thing at a time, move forward step by step, creating a calmer atmosphere as we go. The West certainly would not flinch if it all ended in war. But nobody wanted to end like that. The way led to devastation, and to the misery for all the peoples on both sides, East and West. Although I accepted his statement that he wanted peace, he might not get the peace he needed if he continued to push us about so much. Let us negotiate and cease to irritate each other. So far as Germany was concerned, there were two troubled situations. Two sparks which could light a fire. West Berlin and German peace treaties. He, Mr. Khrushchev, wished to solve them both at the same time. I suggested that a better plan would be to separate the two problems. First, solve the West Berlin situation, and thus produce confidence throughout the Western Alliance, postponing the peace treaty proposals indefinitely until all concerned were satisfied about the Berlin situation. This would take some time, but what did that matter? What would matter was if undue haste brought on a major war. We must not let that happen. Mr. Khrushchev asked how I saw the United Nations handling the Berlin problem. I said that was not my business, but he pressed for my opinion. I then suggested that the matter should be handed over to the Secretary General to investigate and to produce a plan acceptable to both sides. The United Nations force consisting of neutral nations might be introduced gradually into West Berlin, and the forces of the Western nations could possibly be scaled down at some later date, as mutual confidence developed. But any United Nations plan must be acceptable to both blocs, East and West, with firm guarantees for the West Berliners. Mr. Khrushchev said he personally agreed with my views. He admitted he had previously wanted to solve the two German situations at the same time. But he now saw the force of my remarks. In view of what I had said, he was prepared to separate the two problems, tackling the West Berlin problem first and postponing the peace treaty problem for the time being. He would agree to that procedure. He asked me about the inspection plan I had advocated. I said it should not be hurried. Keep it simple. Begin with a small defined area in the middle of Europe and gradually extend it as mutual confidence is restored. Inspection teams must be truly international. The plan, if sound and practical, could well begin at any time. It would all help to remove suspicion and restore confidence. But don't try and force an Eastern plan down the Western throats too quickly. Go quietly at it and evolve a simple plan acceptable to both sides. Mr. Khrushchev said he agreed in principle with what I had said. All in all, it seemed to me that I left Moscow that something had been achieved. Mr. Khrushchev had agreed to separate the two immediately troublesome problems in Germany, to tackle West Berlin first, and to postpone indefinitely the peace treaty proposals. He had shown a willingness to be flexible in his approach to the whole business, and to eliminate all hot war possibilities as a first priority. I myself convinced that neither he nor the Soviet marshals really wanted to achieve their aims by war, a hot war. So far, so good. But no doubt some hard bargaining lay ahead. I will conclude this article by saying that I was received by the Soviet leader and by the Soviet high military authorities with the greatest kindness and courtesy. Our talks, though very frank, were conducted in a most friendly atmosphere. I formed the opinion that Mr. Khrushchev is a most able person. Indeed, I would describe him as brilliant. For my part, I have established a friendly contact with the Soviet leader, and I have received a warm invitation to visit Russia whenever I like, either for further talks or for a holiday. In the next article, I will give some impressions of Moscow and its people, and I will endeavor to assess the possibility of creating such a situation, such a lessening of the tension, the East and West can live and let live for a generation ahead, which would surely be for the benefit of all mankind.